Welcome to Local Control Task 23, Issue Altimeter Setting. What's an altimeter setting? It's the barometric pressure reading used to adjust a pressure altimeter for variations in existing atmospheric pressure or to the standard altimeter of 29902. What this means is conventional aircraft altimeters work by measuring the atmospheric pressure at the airplane's flight altitude and comparing it to preset pressure values. So aircraft have the ability to measure the atmospheric pressure in their aircraft. There's varying technologies in each airframe. Depending on what it is, military aircraft have very advanced atmospheric pressure readings. However, what's important to note is that they're taking the preset value depending upon where they are. So aircraft that are going to depart your airport or runway, they're going to use the altimeter that you issue them, and then they compare that with their measuring in their aircraft, and they can tell how high they are off the ground once they depart or they're working in your pattern. However, once they leave your airfield environment, say they're doing a cross country or they're going to be flying above like 180, what they can do is they can switch their altimeter setting over to 29902, and that means no matter how long their flight is until they descend for their final approach for an airport, they can keep that altimeter setting of 29902 consistent, and they'll always know how high they are above mean sea level. And so that's very important to understand, especially when we have cross country type aircraft. Or they're going to other areas, they're going to change that value depending upon what they need to do. And then when they're coming to land to a runway, they're going to request that arriving information, the altimeter at your local area, so they can understand how high they are off the ground for their approach to your runway. Now, true altitude is the height above mean sea level. So if they're using the altimeter of your local area, they'll know how high they are above the ground, but not necessarily how high they are above mean sea level, unless they use the 29902 altimeter. The absolute altitude is the height above the ground, which is AGL. Pressure altitude is the altitude is shown on the altimeter when the standard atmospheric level of 29902 is entered into their window, or the height above the standard datum point, which the datum point is what we give them. Pressure altitude is often used in flight planning calculations, so it's easier to file a flight plan and calculate how high you're going to be, what your fuel efficiency is going to be if you're using that 29902. Density altitude is something totally different. Pressure altitude adjusted for non-standard temperature. Density often is described as how high the aircraft feels like it is, since the density altitude affects aircraft performance. An example of this is an aircraft has to consider the height of the airport that they're leaving from and the temperature outside. So if you're at a very high airport of like 5,000 feet or something, and it's very hot outside, like over 100 degrees, your aircraft performance is going to decrease, and it might mean that the air is so thin and that your aircraft will not be able to depart with your set requirements, depending upon the runway, how long the runway is. So it affects aircraft greatly. Not so much with military fighter type aircraft, but when you get out of the Air Force and you go to a different base or to a civilian base, you're going to have some lower performance aircraft, and it may drastically change how they fly, especially with helicopters, same thing, issues. And so when the airport, depending on your airport altitude and the temperature outside, you may have to issue to aircraft to check density altitude, and then give them the temperature so they can know whether or not their performance of the aircraft is going to be suffering enough that they can depart or not. The phraseology is pretty basic. Cobra 1-2, altimeter 3012. Estimated altimeter, this is something like if our field weather data is not working correctly, and we're getting altimeter that's maybe a little bit old from weather, we would say Cobra 1-2, estimated altimeter is 3012. When it's not required for us to issue altimeter is if the aircraft requests or state that they have the current ATIS code. If it's part of the landing information, for example, if aircraft calls us up and they're over the TACAN and we don't have any reason to not clear them to land, we can say Cobra 1-2, altimeter 3012, runway 23 left, wind calm, clear to land. If the aircraft says they have the numbers, also it's important to know that sport, not being an air traffic control facility, is not required to pass the arriving information to the airport to us, as opposed to a normal FAA certified radar approach control. So if sport doesn't say they have the numbers, or that they pass the numbers to the aircraft, and if the aircraft doesn't call up with the numbers or with the current ATIS code, we have to give them the runway wind and altimeter and any pertinent information that may be applicable to them on arrival. So that's really important to note. That's something we don't do all the time, but it's important. If you'd like further information on this, you can follow any one of these links, and this is where I got a lot of the information from, and you can go a deeper dive into this information. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good day.